Will Africa ever be allowed by the West to unify? Due to the inability of its nations to cooperate, Africa has been at risk of exploitation. The West has benefited from their inability to find common ground. However, things are evolving. The new leader of Senegal, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, has partnered with Mali, Niger and Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso to resist Western influence. This suggests that the West may no longer be as powerful. Can they maintain their dominance, though? Let's investigate. With Senegal's new leader joining leaders from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in their unwavering demand for autonomy and sovereignty, the continent of Africa is experiencing a profound upheaval. Western capitals are alarmed by this alliance, which aims to subvert Western domination in the area. The continent's fight for independence from outside influences has undergone a dramatic shift, with Senegal's rise to prominence as an advocate of African self-determination. However, what is Senegal's current political position? Senegal, a country known for its thriving democracy and rich cultural legacy, has lately been a focal point in Africa's struggle for independence. As well as autonomy, Senegal has started a daring path to assert its sovereignty and resist outside meddling in its affairs under the direction of a new, dynamic leader. This emergent political position has sent shockwaves through Western capitals and sparked similar movements in adjacent countries, causing ripple effects throughout the continent. A sincere confidence in African answers to African problems is at the core of Senegal's new political position. The determination to steer in a direction that is in line with the interests and ambitions of the Senegalese people has replaced the days of depending on Western assistance and intervention. This is in line with a larger attitude on the continent, where politicians are calling for a more just international system and rejecting the idea that the West is better. Senegal's drive for autonomy is based on a dedication to changing antiquated institutions and procedures that have long impeded the nation's progress. This includes economic measures that put foreign powers' interests ahead of Senegalese citizens. Monetary policy, which advocates for a calculated withdrawal from the CFA franc system, which many perceive as a holdover from colonialism that sustains economic reliance on France, is one of the main areas of emphasis. The goal of economic reform is to provide all Senegalese citizens with chances for progress and prosperity, not merely to free themselves from the constraints of neocolonialism. The new administration in Senegal is dedicated to enacting laws that encourage innovation, entrepreneurship, and inclusive economic growth, because they understand that real independence cannot be attained without economic self-sufficiency. Senegal's new political position vehemently rejects outside intervention in African politics in addition to economic reform. Criticism of Western participation is part of this, especially that of former colonial powers like France, whose military presence in the area has long been a source of hostility and tension. African countries' increasing desire to establish their sovereignty and take back control of their own destiny is reflected in the urge to remove foreign military bases and renegotiate unfair accords. Senegal's emphasis on establishing alliances with other African countries based on respect and solidarity is another important component of its new political position. Senegal has demonstrated its dedication to Pan-Africanism and the idea of African unification through its recent partnership with Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Senegal wants to enhance its position in talks with outside powers and increase its voice on the international scene by forming alliances with its neighbors. Senegal's new political position has far-reaching effects that go well beyond its boundaries. Given the potential for significant ramifications for regional and global geopolitics, the West's response to Senegal's assertiveness will be widely monitored. As African leaders increasingly assert their independence and seek equitable treatment on the global stage, Western powers accustomed to imposing their will on African countries may find themselves on the defensive. However, what does the solidarity of African nations demonstrate to us? Due to historical differences, outside intervention, and conflicting interests, African Nations Union has long been an unattainable objective. But recent events in the Sahel, especially the alliance of Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, show that African countries are now more determined than ever to support one another in the face of difficulties and demands from the outside world. The foundation of this unity is a common vision of African solutions to African problems. African countries have been subject to outside forces whose interests frequently conflict with those of the continent's citizens for far too long. Senegal and its neighbors' partnership is a daring declaration of African agency and autonomy, as well as a rejection of the current status quo. It is impossible to exaggerate the importance of this togetherness. In an area where instability is a problem, Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger's cooperation in the face of poverty and insecurity gives hope for a better future. These countries are sending a strong message to the rest of the globe by uniting. Africa is a force to be reckoned with in world events, not a passive observer. A clear understanding of the value of regional collaboration in tackling shared issues is one of the main factors fostering this newfound togetherness. From fighting organized crime and terrorism to fostering social cohesion and economic growth, the partnership between Senegal and its neighbors offers a forum for cooperation and support. The alliance is also a reflection of African countries' increasing understanding that cooperation, not rivalry, is the best way to advance their interests. By combining their resources and knowledge, Burkina Faso, Mali, Senegal, and Niger can accomplish far more than they could on their own. Overcoming the intricate problems that the Sahel region and the continent face need this collaborative mindset. Additionally, the solidarity of African countries acts as a potent check on outside influence and meddling. African countries have been at the mercy of international powers for far too long, and their interventions frequently make already existing tensions and conflicts worse. Senegal and its neighbors' united stance makes it very evident that outside meddling in African politics will no longer be accepted. Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. The alliance's development among Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger further emphasizes how crucial leadership is to promoting regional cooperation and integration. In particular, the new leader of Senegal has been instrumental in promoting the alliance and outlining an African unity and solidarity vision. A new age of collaboration and partnership has been established as a result of his fearless leadership, which has given his regional counterparts hope and confidence. But there are obstacles in the way of African unification. Regional integration and collaboration are hindered by historical divisions, ethnic tensions, and rivalry among neighboring governments. Furthermore, outside forces may try to weaken the alliance and promote disagreement among its members out of fear of losing influence in the area. In spite of these obstacles, the African Nations Union provides a ray of hope in an otherwise bleak world. In addition to furthering their own interests, Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are building a more prosperous, peaceful, and cohesive Africa by uniting. The hopes and dreams of millions of people around the continent who long for a better future are carried by them as they set out on their trip together. One crucial element that needed to be addressed for African unification was Western intervention. What are these countries' current thoughts on Western intervention then? Over the ages, due to Western nations' many attempts to influence and govern the continent, Africa has served as a battlefield for conflicting interests and goals. African countries have been subjected to exploitation, oppression, and conflict as a result of Western intervention, from the time of colonialism to the present. Western participation in African politics has come under increasing fire in recent years, with activists and leaders denouncing what they see to be a continuation of colonial-era tactics masquerading as humanitarian intervention and development support. The tendency of Western intervention in Africa to put the interests of outside powers ahead of those of African countries and their citizens is one of the main arguments against it. Whether via political interference, economic exploitation, or military action, African sovereignty and self-determination have frequently been sacrificed in the service of Western countries' ambitions. African populists and leaders have become deeply distrustful and resentful as a result, believing that outside forces are undermining their autonomy and ignoring their views. The deployment of Western military personnel in African nations, purportedly to fight terrorism and pacify war-torn areas, has been a particularly divisive topic in recent years. Western governments frequently defend their military actions as essential to preserving peace and security, while detractors contend that these actions have simply increased tensions and stoked new acts of violence. The cycle of violence and instability has been exacerbated by the numerous instances in which Western military operations have led to civilian deaths, relocation, and the degradation of fundamental liberties and rights. The continuation of economic dependency and exploitation is another facet of Western influence in Africa that has drawn criticism. Western nations have been exploiting Africa's natural riches for ages, taking money and leaving a legacy of underdevelopment and poverty in its wake. Many African countries still struggle with high rates of poverty, unemployment, and inequality in spite of the rhetoric surrounding aid and development assistance, worsened by exploitative contracts and unjust trade practices enforced by Western firms. Additionally, detractors highlight the hypocrisy of Western governments and international organizations, which frequently promote the values of democracy, human rights, and good governance while ignoring their role in sustaining oppression and injustice in Africa. Western nations have frequently put their geopolitical interests ahead of the welfare of African inhabitants, undermining the very ideals they profess to promote by supporting authoritarian regimes and ignoring violations of human rights. Furthermore, the lack of sustainability and long-term vision in Western intervention in Africa has drawn criticism. All too frequently, Western governments and international organizations tackle difficult issues like poverty, illness, and conflict in a fragmented, short-term manner, neither addressing the underlying causes of these issues or interacting with local institutions and communities in a meaningful way. Instead of building their abilities to handle their problems on their own, African countries now depend on outside help, creating a vicious circle of vulnerability and dependency. African officials and activists have been speaking out more against Western engagement in recent years, demanding a more equal and balanced strategy for dealing with the continent. This includes requests for reparations and atonement for the historical injustices committed against the continent, as well as for increased responsibility and openness by Western governments and businesses doing business in Africa. Additionally, African countries are realizing more and more how crucial regional solidarity and collaboration are to tackling shared issues and defending their interests as a group on the international scene. By uniting and speaking with a single voice, African countries are better equipped to withstand outside influence and pressure and steer toward a more wealthy, peaceful, and independent future. What are the thoughts of the new unity toward economic reforms? One of the main pillars of Africa's struggle for independence and self-determination is the reform of economic policies. Leaders and decision-makers throughout the continent are realizing more and more how important it is to escape the constraints of neocolonialism and set out on a new path toward wealth and economic growth. The drive for economic policy reform is gathering steam as African countries look to regain control of their economic futures and express their sovereignty, from requests for currency reform to demands for fair trade and investment policies. The reform of monetary systems that impede economic progress and sustain reliance is a primary aim of African economic policy reform. The CFA franc, which is based on the euro and managed by the French Treasury, is one of the currencies that many African nations still use. Critics contend that by prioritizing the interests of the former colonial powers over those of African residents, These monetary arrangements restrict the capacity of African countries to implement autonomous monetary policies and impede economic growth. A strategic withdrawal from currency unions such as the CFA franc and the adoption of national currencies that more accurately represent the economic reality and ambitions of African countries have been advocated in response to these worries. Regaining economic sovereignty and establishing control over monetary policy is made possible by Senegal's recent decision to abandon the CFA franc system and adopt a new national currency. Currency reform goes beyond merely claiming sovereignty, but also about generating chances for economic expansion and advancement. African countries can pursue monetary policies that are specific to their needs and priorities instead of having them dictated by other parties by adopting national currencies. This can lessen the effect of external shocks on home economies, encourage investment, and increase export competitiveness. Promoting fair trade and investment policies that put the interests of African countries and their citizens first is another crucial component of economic policy reform in Africa. With little value to its people, Africa has too long been used as a cheap labor and raw material supplier to the rest of the globe. By guaranteeing that African countries are fairly compensated for their labor and resources, and have more influence over the conditions of trade and investment agreements, the movement for fair trade and investment practices aims to rebalance this equation. One of the primary barriers to economic progress in Africa is the continued existence of unfair trade dealings with other countries. Despite the rhetoric of globalization and free trade, African countries struggle to reach foreign markets and are subjected to unfair competition from subsidized goods and products. By supporting the removal of trade restrictions, the abolition of agricultural subsidies in the global north, and the promotion of equitable trade practices that benefit all stakeholders, economic policy reform seeks to level the playing field. Africa's economic policy reform entails tackling both internal and external obstacles to development and progress. This entails investing in education and skill development, fortifying institutions, and enhancing infrastructure in order to create a robust and resilient economy that can contend in the global economy. As part of its larger goal for economic development, Senegal's new leadership has made these sectors a priority and pledged to put policies in place that support equitable growth, as well as sustainable growth. Additionally, initiatives to address the underlying causes of poverty and inequality, such as land reform, credit availability, and social security programs, must go hand in hand with economic policy reform in Africa. African countries may foster economic growth and development that benefits all facets of society, especially the most disadvantaged and vulnerable, by tackling these fundamental structural problems. Improving economic indices and building a brighter future for all Africans are the ultimate goals of economic policy reform. African countries may clear the way to wealth and create a better, more sustainable future for coming generations by reaffirming their sovereignty over monetary policy, encouraging fair trade and investment practices, and removing internal obstacles to growth and development. African countries are regaining their proper position on the international scene as they continue to advocate for changes to their economic policies and mold the destiny of the continent according to their wishes. Exploitation and future collaborations were a crucial topic to explore. The countries must establish guidelines for equitable collaborations if they are aligned. What did they do then? Resource exploitation has long been a controversial topic in Africa, as multinational firms and Western nations are frequently charged with stealing the natural resources of the continent for their own benefit. Africa has a wealth of resources, from water and agricultural land to minerals and oil, which have drawn the interest of international investors hoping to make money off of its abundance. However, economic dependency, social unrest, and environmental destruction are the results of resource extraction in Africa. Calls for equitable partnerships that put the interests of African countries and their citizens first result from this. The unequal distribution of advantages and liabilities associated with resource development in Africa is a major point of contention. Local communities frequently suffer the most from the negative effects of resource extraction in Africa, such as relocation, pollution, and loss of livelihoods, while multinational businesses earn greatly from the process. Corrupt practices and a lack of transparency in resource governance make this disparity in advantages and responsibilities worse by enabling foreign investors to take advantage of Africa's resources with little consideration for the long-term sustainability of the environment or the well-being of local inhabitants. African countries have realized more and more in recent years how important it is to renegotiate resource contracts and form equitable alliances with foreign investors. This includes calls for procedures to guarantee that local communities profit fairly from resource extraction, as well as for increased accountability and transparency in resource governance. This movement has been led by Senegal's new administration, which is pushing for a more sustainable and inclusive method of managing the nation's natural resources. The idea of resource nationalism, which upholds African countries' rights to govern and manage their natural resources for the benefit of their people, is one of the fundamental ideas that underpin equitable collaborations in resource extraction. In order to manage money for future generations, this entails creating sovereign wealth funds, raising royalties and taxes on resource production, and expanding state control of vital resources. African countries may guarantee that their natural riches be utilized to advance development and enhance the well-being of their citizens rather than being embezzled by foreign interests by claiming sovereignty over them. Promoting sustainable techniques that reduce environmental harm and uphold local populations' rights is another facet of equitable partnerships in resource development. This entails carrying out environmental impact analyses prior to resource project approval, putting policies in place to lessen adverse effects on ecosystems and biodiversity, and speaking with impacted communities to make sure their opinions and worries are taken into consideration. As part of its larger strategy for environmental preservation and sustainable development, Senegal's new government has underlined the need of sustainable resource management. A dedication to inclusive and participatory decision-making processes that incorporate all stakeholders, including local communities, civil society organizations, and indigenous peoples, is also necessary for equitable partnerships in resource exploitation. Making sure impacted communities have access to information regarding resource projects and their possible effects, as well as chances to engage in decision-making processes that impact their lives and means of subsistence, is part of this. African countries may foster social cohesion and trust, while ensuring that resource extraction benefits all, not just a few, by giving local communities a say in resource governance. African countries must diversify their economies and lessen their reliance on the export of natural resources, while also encouraging equitable partnerships and resource use. This calls for spending on manufacturing, services, agriculture, and laws that encourage creativity, entrepreneurship, and the advancement of skills. The development of a more robust and diverse economy can help African countries become less susceptible to changes in the price of commodities and give their population access to more inclusive and sustainable growth prospects. In the end, encouraging equitable development and lowering poverty and inequality in Africa depend on just collaborations in resource exploitation. African countries may guarantee that resource extraction benefits everyone, not just a chosen few, by claiming sovereignty over their natural resources, encouraging sustainable methods, and include all stakeholders in decision-making processes. African countries recover their rightful position as stewards of their destiny and continue to define the future of the continent on their own terms as they strive for equitable partnerships. Do you believe that a united Africa portends a brighter future? Is Africa unity the greatest fear of the West? What does the future hold for the West in Africa? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. We explore the rich history, culture, and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty in Africa. Join us in this important conversation by subscribing to our channel. By subscribing, you're not just staying informed, you're becoming part of a movement dedicated to reclaiming Africa's rightful place on the global stage. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's work together to spread knowledge and inspire change. Thanks for watching.